Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast, where we ignite the sparks of change and inspire a world free of racism. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting the most cutting-edge anti-racist research and education for the purpose of connecting practitioners to powerful research-based approaches to racial equity. I am your host, Dr. Tracey A. Benson, and today we invite you on a transformative journey as we delve into the efforts and triumphs of those dedicated to fostering racial equity within education. Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research and Practice podcast. Today, we have the opportunity to talk with Dr. Crystal Harden-Lindsey. Dr. Harden-Lindsey has been a principal, she's been a teacher, she's been an executive director, and now she's our chief program officer here at the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute. Thank you for coming on the show today, Dr. Harden-Lindsey.
Thank you for having me. Excited to jump in.
So what you were saying is that you're getting into reflection mode. So
Yes.
Go ahead. Continue.
So you the year, so you start thinking about like what you've learned over the years, especially like the one you're sitting in. And I think this year in general is really pivotal because we're going to be going into new federal administration. And like what that means for the state of education, especially in urban areas. Is it really going to be space where our new president would dismantle the U.S. Department of Education? If so, what does that mean for educators across our nation? And so I think that many educators, including myself, I'm in just full reflection mode. Like, who am I today as a school leader? Am I what students need or what educators need? And like, how have I grown? And what gaps do I continue to see in myself, as well as like, in places where kids aren't getting high quality experiences. Like where can I fill in that gap and what does that mean for me? And so I think when I talk to most educators, they're mostly in this space of like reflection, like what have I done from August to December and how can I be better from January to June, better for students? So I think like everyone is in that space.
Right. The problem is still here. For me, I like the work doesn't change. Whether you're in a state where you can talk about DEI, whether you're not, whether you disband the federal Department of Education, the work stays the same. When you're on the ground, you still got kids you got to serve. Like education has to run in this country, and so I think there's an amount of like healthy anxiety and unhealthy anxiety, and I find that folks that get into the unhealthy space are sort of catastrophizing. And every generation is like that. What I find is funny is like every time, I talk to folks from different generations, they're like, oh, it's just changed so much. Like, yeah, it's supposed to change, right? We're not supposed to, when I grew up in the 80s, like, I hope school doesn't look like that no more, right? We're not doing reel-to-reel film and writing on sheets of paper and all that. It's supposed to change. And with that, the kids are not going to stay the same. And so, but the problems, unfortunately, have still presented themselves where kids of color still aren't receiving the education that they need. And as you say, like, how can we be better,
Yes.
with what we do?
Yes.
So what's something you learned about like a sort of a core disposition? There we go. A core leadership disposition that you typically coach around because we support leaders. And how do you reflect back on how you might coach yourself with that disposition when you were a leader?
I think I underestimated the power and strength of social emotional intelligence as a leader. I think that being more socially aware of who I am in the seat and confident in why I'm doing the work and ensuring that my commitment is to students, not just adult actions. Because oftentimes when I look back, we did all these wonderful things to please adults, but there were many cases, I should never say never. There were many cases where we prioritize adult comfort. But a part of that was like my social emotional intelligence. Like, how do I balance being an effective leader, ensuring that I'm pushing a vision, but making sure that students are that focal point? I think there were many times where I lost that. It would be the minutia of like what was happening around me or things that seeped into my building based on the community and the neighborhood. Leaders that have strong social emotional intelligence oftentimes are the people who can galvanize and create that shared vision versus this idea of division. And so something that I continuously work on day after day, just like how can I become more aware of who I am and also accept the fact that I'm evolving. Like who I was yesterday, I'm not today, and that's okay too. Yes.
and that which leads us to take a lot of things personally. When faculty just act up, right?
Yes.
We think it's about
Mhm.
us, and we
Yes.
fail to reflect on what is it about the environment that we've inherited, and the
Mhm.
seat that we're in, and how faculty are going to act, with relation to us just because we're the principal. It's nothing to do with our personality. It's nothing to do with our disposition. But, teachers have experiences with previous administrators, and they often imprint that on the administrator. And I will spend so much time trying to be like, oh, that's not who I am. I'm this
Yes.
person, trying to sort of
Yes.
prove myself and taking
Yes.
my eye off the goals, right? We
Yes.
definitely had goals. We definitely had a
Yeah.
strategy. We definitely had data, data teams, and data talks, and all the infrastructure to move student learning. But I think the internal dialogue, I just made it so much about me
Yes.
rather than about, okay, how can I be the best leader? And
Mhm.
something that David Lyons, he was my mentor, taught me, and I talk about all the time. He's like, when you're in a position of leadership, or any position for that matter in the job, but especially in leadership, like you have to separate your identity from your self identity from your identity as a leader, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Because if your self identity, like you're awesome, like what's your identity outside of school? Like, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I love to play tennis, I think I have a lot of good friends, people see me in a very positive light, and people in my close circle, and to keep that sacred, to say I'm an awesome person. And when you
Mhm.
come into the school building, you're not an awesome leader.
Mhm.
Absolutely not. Right? No
Mhm.
one is fully formed. You are a public learner, and you
Yes.
have to sort of take that disposition even when it's tough. And I find when I'm coaching leaders, as well in my own experience, I put those two identities together,
Mm.
meaning that
Mm.
what the criticism I received as a leader, I took it as a reflection on me personally.
Yes.
And I find that's what's burning leaders out. That's what burnt me out.
Yes.
Right. I would take it home. I'd ruminate it over, criticism all weekend long. I'm like, wow, that's not true. They don't know me. And, that's not a place that kept me in a good sort of mentally healthy space, because I
Yeah.
took things so personally. And so thinking through how I impart this on other leaders when I notice them falling into this trap. And like, it's
Mhm.
not about you. They're not
Mhm.
commenting, they're commenting on the position. And you need to have, non-defensive leadership, right? You
Yes.
can't be defensive and expect it to galvanize folks around a vision. Because sometimes I
Mhm.
still take things personally. I have to, you know, just step back, breathe, right? And be like, I can still do things better as a leadership
Yes.
coach. Like, I'm not perfect. I
Yes.
don't know it all.
Mhm.
So what is your biggest challenges in terms of addressing with leaders that you see potential, but what is the barriers you try to help them get out of the way for themselves? What have you learned from the folks that you've been coaching over the past few years? Yeah.
One of the things that Dr. Benson and I continue to talk to leaders about is like their biases, but even the ones about themselves. So, like when you talk to a leader, I can think of one leader in general who, like, they have these preconceived notions about themselves based on what others have told them, and they have believed it. And then they believe that that has become a part of their leadership. An example might be, I'm thinking of a leader who talks about his level of selfishness. Like he
Mm,
just wants to shine according to what other people have told him about himself. And he's like, so I constantly think about that. Like I think about like, am I sharing the spotlight? When something good happens, am I sharing it? Am I moving in a way that is reflective of like a selfless or servant leader? I want to be a servant leader. He
mm,
consistently says that, but in the same breath, he says, but I know I'm selfish. So like, tell me more about that. Well, I've been told that my whole life. As a kid, and even he told me about a story when he was in college, and he's like, and I guess I just have like I'm owning it. And I said, well, but do you have to? He's like, and it might show up in my leadership like this and like that. So like this idea of like mental models where people have told you things about yourself and then you believe it. And you
mm.
believe like you are married to it, like you're going to be this forever. So this negative concept about your personality, sort of like what you just described, like now it's a part of your leadership and it just is. So like how do you begin to think about who you are in a more adaptive way? Yeah.
Interesting, because we hear that, you got to bring your full self. You got to be your authentic self in leadership, right? Or it's going to show either way,
Yes.
right? But being your authentic self and recognizing your strengths and weaknesses is a part of being a leader.
Yes.
And I remember in my case, right, this goes along with what you're talking about. In my case, at the time, so I became a principal at 32, and I had never been a high school. I'd never been in a high school outside of the time I went to high school, right? So I'm an elementary school teacher, right? That's my
Okay.
training. I'm a fourth grade teacher
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
happened to get a AP job in a middle school. My first full-time AP job was in a middle school. I
Mhm.
only worked in that job for 18 months until I got pushed up to the high school. Right. I mean, we did a lot of prolific things at the middle school. I think that's why they're like, all right, well, this high school needs some work. And I'm like, I'm an elementary school teacher. Right.
Yeah.
And so I was very formal. I wore a suit every day. I had concrete agendas. I tried to really squeeze out wasted time. I did classroom observations. I was trying to be what I thought to be a professional principal. And we made a lot of great progress. And I also know that I'm not the greatest people person. That's not my Myers Briggs, right? I'm not trying to, come to your classroom and talk to you about your family, right? That's just not my personality, right? I worked on that, and being encouraging. But when I left a position, I did a leadership 360. And on my leadership 360, I was, it was pretty even around they give you all these different characteristics that you're strong on or weak on. But there was one characteristic that I scored in the 99th percentile
Mm.
according to my staff. So the Leadership 360 is when you give surveys to, people who work with you. So I gave my survey to teachers, to administrators who work with me, to support staff. So I think I had around like 60 people who took the survey and gave me my profile. And across the board, I scored in the 99th percentile with all of them, 99th percentile with distance. And
Mm.
what was in the comments were folks consistently like, we knew you as a principal, but we didn't get to know the real you, right? You constantly call people Mr. and Mrs. You were very formal. When you came to show social events, you would stay for like 10 minutes, and you were good while you were there, but we wanted to see the real you.
Mm.
And I've accepted that, that's a part of my personality. That I'm not really trying to be buddy buddy with folks, especially when it comes to kids. Like I can be buddy buddy with kids. I love kids. And if
Mm.
we're educators, we got a job to do. Right.
Yes.
I
Yes.
do see it as a growth area that I need to work on and a set level of acceptance that, you know what, I can't change this. This is my authentic me. So what do you
Mm.
think about that when when you talk about that situation where, he's calling himself selfish, which is kind of a pejorative term. I don't think I want to be selfish,
Mm.
but between acceptance of that's me and I'm gonna work with my strengths and sort of acknowledge my weaknesses to, or is it something that folks should focus, should I be more social, buddy buddy? I don't know, I'm looking for your what you think about that.
I think that there's balance. And I don't think anything is concrete except like your physical appearance. In some cases, that's not even concrete. And so like he may be selfish. He may have been a selfish college student. That does not mean that he'll be a selfish leader. Like today does not equal tomorrow. And I think what happens is we get caught up in this idea that this is who we are, this is who we will always be. But that's not true as it relates to descriptors about personalities. I believe people change. I think that everything is about choice.
Mm,
I can be dismissive at home, at school, with my mate. And I think what has happened over time is that I use dismissiveness as a coping mechanism.
mm,
So that I'm not totally overwhelmed by what you hear people talk about being empath. I could never be because I'm not taking all that in. Everything you shared, I'm not taking that in. Like I have to let some of this roll off my shoulders, right? And so while I know that I can be dismissive, one of the things that I always think about as we think about reflection and becoming my best self is like, how did I get like that? Is it something that serves me sometimes? And I would say yes. In leadership, like if you take in every single thing and everything is on fire every time someone brings it to you, that's how you develop those high levels of stress and you become sick at work and then you ultimately hate your job. But if you find a happy balance to whatever that characteristic is, you can then use it for good. So like
mm,
even this leader who said like I'm selfish, I'm like, well, tell me more about that. And as he began to talk, um, I wasn't getting selfish. I was getting more self aware. Like he
mm,
knows when someone is getting over on him, and he's not afraid to let you know early enough that like this is not going to work. So if you are dismissive and you like live in that, so you work hard to be more dismissive in some cases. This is who I am versus when is it good to use this? Does this make sense in this context? And understanding that every context is different. And in life, you have to find balance. So we all have What I would say, what people call as the gift and the curse, and it could be in a descriptor. So, like my dismissiveness, right, is a gift when I'm in a high stress situation. I am not about to be stressed out, falling out because someone else is falling out. I'm really good under pressure, which is a part of that dismissiveness. It shows up, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
other side to that is when someone needs my ear, I need to be able to listen and take in what they're saying, and that has to be balanced. But if you go too far on either side of the coin, it can be dangerous. Being okay with the flexibility and personality and emotionality. Like your emotions can show up in different ways and it can serve you in some cases, and sometimes it can be a hindrance. How do you find that balance? And acknowledgement and being self aware, I believe, is half the battle. So that is
Yeah.
how I see that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, right? And you talk about contextual,
Yes.
that when you're sort of your tendencies as a leader start to get in the way of your leadership, as you
Yes.
say, right? That in one context, being dismissive, it allows you to exist in a very stressful environment, right? That you're
Yes.
not going to ingest all that, and you change into another context where someone's actually coming to you and they need to be heard. That it doesn't
Yes.
serve you well. I hear that, and I think in sort of reflecting on what you just said about my distance is that maybe I'm not the greatest about getting out there and getting into classrooms, at times where teachers are just sitting down and chit chat, right?
Yes.
And, maybe there are settings where I needed to sort of activate my ability for people to get to know me so they can trust me that
Yes.
that they're in my best interest. And so choosing strategic times to do that, which I didn't do. So I want to sort of talk about three things, and I don't know which order you want to discuss these, but one thing is conflict avoidance. That has been something where the most talented, intelligent, strong leaders, I find myself constantly coming back to conflict avoidance,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
I want to talk about, accountability, right, which often goes hand in hand with conflict avoidance. And the third thing I want to talk about is how, and I said this before, about how to be sort of hold ourselves as much as we can in the area of non-defensiveness, right? Because I think that's what provides the most discord with people
Yes.
is when leaders get defensive, right? And I remember, like, one, I was young, trying to do the best I could, and I took things very personally, so I got very defensive often. And that really did push forward a lot of the discussion. People felt shut down. Folks then, all right, he's just not flexible. I
Mhm.
wasn't saying that. I was saying the way you said it made me defensive, but I realizing that as a leader, they can't make me defensive. That the way I interpret what they're saying, I take it personally, and then I get defensive, which then shuts down the conversation. And so, wherever you want to take it, conflict avoidance, accountability, non-defensiveness. What are your thoughts around these attributes of a leader?
Let's tackle conflict avoidance. Let's tackle that one. I think, the biggest piece with conflict avoidance is people have a fear of failure. So most times I believe people avoid conflict because they're afraid that they're going to say or do something wrong versus, this idea of I'm going to approach this and I'm hoping that I learn something. They don't approach it in a way where they're curious. So, like, I want to understand, but you have to address it. You have to go through it. And then, last but not least, of course, once you get to that place, you figure out that you don't have to love all your colleagues, but you do have to respect them. And now you guys can perform at a high level. But without going through those three pieces, the storming, norming, and then performing, oftentimes people are stuck in the storming. And instead of working through, to understand someone else's perspective or to go in curious, they lose people along the way, which also stifles momentum. For even people who have the best intentions and who like really believe in the leader, once they see those people just dropping off and there's no sense of understanding or curiosity, it still changes the morale and the culture of the organization. So being okay with going through those three phases will help you when it comes to confronting confronting like anything happening in your environment, and you can then create a culture where all people can feel like they can speak up, and that becomes your norm, that becomes your culture.
Right. No, and I can relate with that because I've been coaching this superintendent for years at this point.
Mhm.
And She came back from a summer of professional development with another superintendent was at, and she's like, I think I want to adopt a phrase. We're going to have an intolerance for failure. And I was like, oh, tell me more. And so in her school district, she has a K-12 district, so she has elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and her failure rates were really high. I mean, not like 90%, but too high for comfort in the middle schools and especially in the high schools, right? Especially with Latino students. And so she's like, we need to sort of capture this in a phrase to have an intolerance for failure, right? Because right now, I think folks are too accepting that we have 30% of Latino boys failing every semester at the middle school level, that's not okay, right?
Mhm.
So we need to sort of put out phraseology that lets us know that this is not okay and we want to have
Mhm.
an intolerance for failure. She was super jazzed, hyped about it. We're talking about it's like, all right, we're going to introduce this at the next meeting. Fantastic. She came back a month later. She's like, you know what? I don't know if I can say that. I was like, why is that? Right. And this is the conflict avoidance piece, right? Is
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
it's going to throw them into storming, right?
Yeah.
What does it mean to have an intolerance for
Mhm.
failure?
Yeah.
Are people going to be like, oh, it's impossible? Like, that's an impossible feat. We can't have 100 other students pass. Like, you're asking too much of us. We have too much on our plate. That's probably what's going to happen in terms of when we say intolerance or failure, and then setting that bar for accountability, because we can't
Mhm.
get to the accountability piece without engaging in the perceived conflict, right? Because it's going to produce conflict, but that's going to then throw us into the necessary space of storming, right? And so we came back after a couple of meetings. This didn't happen right away. I was like, all right, let's come back and actually work through what this would mean and how you're going to explain it, right? Intolerance for failure means not that we have to have 100% passing rates every quarter. That'd be great if it could happen, but you're not going to go from a 30% failure rate to a 100% passing rate.
That's
It's not
right.
going to happen,
That's right.
right? But what's reasonable?
Mhm.
What's reasonable?
Mhm.
And so, in order to get her comfortable with reasonableness, we actually took out the data. Like, all right, who's failing? How bad are they feeling? What are their attendance rates? What are their behavior patterns, right? Which
Mhm.
students are failing one or two classes, right? And so we sort of crunched the numbers and just said, okay, if this percentage of students, we got them over the finish line with a C or above. And not that these students who are failing are throwaway students, but these are students who have like, chronic absences. They have like really intense behavior issues that academically they don't have an academic history of achieving at grade level. So we can't necessarily expect them to be, um, fully passing every quarter. So once we took out the ones that are reasonable, it's like, all right, an intolerance for failure looks like so going from 30% in this particular school to 10%, because that means these 20% of students should not be on the failure list because these are the attributes they have and we can push. So when she did introduce it to the principals, the response is a lot different when she could explain it. It did go to the storming period where they can, and I agree that folks, when you hear something that's jarring to you, you can be in a space where you're like, oh my goodness, I don't know how we're going to do this.
That's
You
right.
can sort of just do the emotional release. You can be there.
Yes.
And I was like, but Tracy, you can't allow them. I'm talking about me, Tracy. You can't allow them to stay there. You can be
Yeah.
there. Let's get
Yes.
be in this emotional space, and
Yes.
but you can't allow them to stay there. And
Yes.
so, um, once the she once the superintendent then brought the conversation up and defined it, then during the storming period there was a collective sense like, all right, how are we going to do this after we did the emotional release? Like, all right, how are we going to make this happen? Which is
Yeah.
awesome that
Yes.
folks got into the thinking thing like, yes, intolerance for failure, yes, we need to have a bar and we need to
Yeah.
be able to explain it to our teachers so they can go through their own storming period,
That's right.
right?
That's right. That's
And
right.
they create new levels of accountability. And so now they're moving the bar because they've gone through that process. Now they've collectively agreed on accountability. So it's
Yeah.
not just top down. It's like this is
Yes.
we are going to hold ourselves accountable for and each other accountable for. And so I think without the ability to engage in conflict, setting
Yes.
that collective accountability becomes very,
That's
very difficult, as you say.
That's right. That's the norming piece. So now that they are collectively coming together and saying, like, hey, this is what it looks like for us. Now, how do you get it to the next level? Is like now you take what you guys have developed collectively and take it to your teachers. Now let's storm this through. And let me tell you about the norms we created. Let me tell you where we started. When the superintendent introduced it to us, this is what it felt like. Does it feel the same to you? Let's go through this. Let's hit the bumps in the road. And so then by the time it kind of permeates through the system, they can get to a place where they're performing at a high rate. And when they bring new people in, it becomes the norm for them to understand what it means because anyone can talk to them about it. I always say the tricky part about leadership is like laying out what's really happening and being okay with some people are not like, I'm not down with that. Somebody will tell you, like, oh, I didn't sign up to do that. And that's okay. But that means that you probably shouldn't be here because this is where we're going. Do you
Mm-hmm.
want to go? No. Okay. Then let's figure out how to get you off this train into a train that you're more comfortable with.
Being able to be a courageous practitioner and a reflective practitioner that this is going to be the emotions are going to be a part of it, and we're going to have to navigate that. And it's okay for folks to feel negative emotions because that's the part of the
Yes.
process to reset, right?
Yes.
Because it's that sense of loss, that sense of safety. Like when the school district had the 30% failure rate, it was predictable. Folks had sort of quietly accepted that,
Yeah.
and it was something where there was maybe lip service to it, but no real
Yes.
accountability. So it
Yes.
felt safe.
Yes.
But what feels unsafe is to change that number and be like, oh my gosh, we knew it wasn't okay, but we never thought we'd actually have to do something about
Yes. Yes.
it. Right. And
Yes.
now there's accountability and there's fear that comes out with folks who are now emotional, like, well, I look like a failure because I can't do it.
That's right. That's right. That's
Right.
right. And
And I
that's where
think, yeah.
advocacy comes in too. Like, do you believe you can do it? Meaning the adult. Like, as an adult, do I believe that I could truly move the needle? And when you have educators that are not sure if they have what it takes to move the needle, that's also where that emotionality comes up because they are wrestling with the fact that they want the kids to be successful. But I've been doing this for 20 years and 30% of my kids always fail. So what is going to happen now? And I've been okay. I've been able to fly under the radar because I show up, because I'm consistent. And maybe you need to do something different, but I don't know that I can do it. And so then now the insecurities come up, and it's the leader's job to kind of temper some of that and kind of build in the infrastructure that they need to feel successful.
Yeah, yeah. And there's that edge where, someone's really afraid, they sort of express it and they're emotional about it, that it's always been this way. They try to externalize, like, oh, how am I going to change these conditions for the kids outside? That's where folks always go. Well, their home life is this way. Well, the last year they didn't perform as well. Well, these excuses to externalize. That comes from a place of, can I actually make the change?
Yes.
And that fine line between, yes, I still expect you to make the change. I'll
Yeah.
support you through your emotionality.
Yeah.
And then deciding at some point in time whether they're on that train,
Yeah.
right? Are you trying enough to move the needle? Are you changing your practice? Are you being reflective? Are you trying to buy into we can do things differently to support these students in a different way? Or if you're just sort of conforming while I'm around,
Yes.
right? So you
Yes.
have the words like when I come in, you're doing the teacher action, so I never see that you're not actually doing it. And when your data comes out and it's still the same, that tough conversation around like, all right, this is the way we're going, and we're
Mm.
not seeing you. We're seeing you sort of. You have the words behind it, but we're not seeing the actions,
That's right.
right? We're not seeing the outcomes, and
Mm.
so we have to engage in another courageous, conversation with conflict around. We have to be sort of, I think, humane in a way that these are the expectations here, and it doesn't sound like it's a fit for you anymore. What can I do
That's
to
right.
support you?
That's it. So,
Wonderful, wonderful. And so I think the third thing I was talking about was non-defensiveness, and defensiveness in leadership, which is something where I struggled with all throughout my leadership journey. Acknowledge and recognize when I was being defensive, and I think that is an invaluable skill in leadership because defensiveness it could be a statement, we're not talking about this, or it could be a question, right? It's still a defensive question, right? Or it could be a
mhm.
way of taking the conversation and planning in a defensive manner. And so all these iterations of defensiveness I find are hinder the ability of a leader to be effective. And a leader can be it could go a whole day with being defensive against teachers, defensive against students, right? And how, in your opinion, how do we strategize, help leaders strategize around being self-aware enough that when their defensive responses or their defensiveness is coming into play, how to get them to pause and really self-reflect before they give a defensive response?
That's tough because for me, I think my defensiveness shows up like off camera, if that makes sense. So I can take it all in. And when that person closes, you ever see a cartoon where like They're taking it, the person's just sitting there, they're calm. There's a meme on the internet that has like the same person sitting, and they're like, this is what it looks like on the outside. And the person's just sitting, and they're saying, yes, yes, yes. But on the inside, they're like burning up. They're like jumping out of their skin, and it's the same person, but it's it. And so for me, I think a part of how I've been taught to deal with defensiveness is alone, which is not always healthy. So, like, I'll take it all in. And when the person leaves, I'm like, what is wrong with John? Why would he say that to me? That really upsets me. And so, this idea of like not being defensive, I think is tricky because I may not be defensive on the surface, but on the inside, I'm still defensive, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think the best thing to do is to ask more about it. Like, I think the key to like life and learning and growing is asking more questions. Like, don't respond to just have a response. Instead, respond so you can have a deeper understanding. So when someone feels they give you some feedback, like my feedback about being defensive, I will always be in my feelings about it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why? Because I didn't give you the response you were looking for. You were looking for me to get mad, but really that's my defensiveness showing up, right? And my coping strategy is just not to, not to respond in an emotional way, right? I'm not cut like that. I'm a person who I like my feet on the ground, is all I'll say. I like to be very like steady, right? And neutral. And so a part of it is like working to understand why this person is saying this. Like, what about that? What about what I said made you feel like I was trying to belittle you? You know, in many cases, I'm thinking back to one particular situation when I was a principal. I had to learn the hard way, like that. I just need to understand, like, help me to understand why you thought that or what made you do that. So, like, the best example is that I had teachers when I was a principal, when I first started at this one school, and they didn't have a dress code. So teachers would come in, they had on their jeans and like t-shirts, and they had rips in their jeans. And but let me tell you this, Dr. Benson, you're gonna love this. But we had kids in uniforms wearing a tie and a tucked in shirt and slacks every day. Something about this just doesn't feel good to me. So the kids are in ties, slacks, and button down. But the teachers basically have on jeans. They look like they could go to the beach.
Uh,
This is not cool. Do you guys like this uniform you chose? And then I found out, because I was brand new, that the teachers actually picked the uniform for the kids
wow.
to wear. So you pick this uniform for the kids to wear, but instead you have on jeans with rips and your tummy showing a little bit, just a little teeny bit. But to me, that was way too much, And so,
Mm-hmm.
this idea, it became that I was just like a tyrant about clothes. And
Mm-hmm.
why do I care so much about clothes? And I was defensive in that I didn't want them to know that I was thinking, how dare you put these kids in these uniforms and you come in here like this? That's what I was thinking,
Mm-hmm.
right? I didn't say that. So I would just, you're not doing that. This is not how we're going to conduct ourselves. Versus having the conversation like, how did they get these uniforms? Like, who? It was at a committee. I didn't do that. I just went in straight defensive. This is my school. This is how we're going to do it. And it caused me nothing but drama and stress and more people saying, get her crazy self out of here. And what I learned quickly was that my stance should have been more around understanding how we got there because I was brand new. So stop making assumptions about what I thought was the case, but more asking questions to understand. Not just asking questions for the sake of asking them or just to respond. Like, you're asking questions because you truly want to understand. If you don't do that, you're going to always be defensive and it's going to be really hard to grow.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And that, in terms of asking questions, because I think when something hits us emotionally, we don't always assume positive intent because it hits us emotionally somewhere that we feel like we're implicated,
Yes.
right? Are you
Yes.
commenting on who I am? Okay, well, and you're
Yes.
not doing it from a positive place. I have to admit, I just learned about this because the concept of psychological safety, one client is doing a lot of stuff on psychological safety, right? I didn't know very much about it. I heard the term, I didn't know what it meant.
Yeah.
right? But since we're involved with the client and that is their umbrella of psychological safety within their organization, I had to start doing some research on, okay, what is it? What does it mean? And what are the foundational sort of theoretical underpinnings of psychological safety? And one of the theoretical underpinnings is transactional analysis, in
Mhm.
analyzing the interactions between individuals and just one-on-one, but also interactions between people within an organization. And what the theory posits is that there's three states of ego: parent, adult, and then there's your child state. So we all have these states that function within ourselves at any given time, right? And if two adults are functioning as an adult to adult, that tends to lower the level of defensiveness, right? Because we're treating each other as colleagues. But in a hierarchy, in schools, right, we're a principal, we often get pushed to the role of a parent, meaning you're
Mhm.
the boss, and then you have the subordinate here, right?
Yes.
We
Yes.
can act as colleagues. That is possible.
Yes.
But when defensiveness comes into play, we push ourselves up to the role of parent, meaning the boss, and the person down to the role of subordinate. And if we're functioning from this space,
Yeah.
we're defensive, they're frustrated because they're not heard. And unless we are able to right the ship and be like, all right, no, even though we have different positions, we still need to relate colleague to colleague because my
Yes.
decisions affect you and I have to respect that. And often the hierarchy leads us into this space
Mhm.
where we have a lot of frustration. So I put the impetus on the leader. If you choose to be a leader, it's your responsibility to be non-defensive.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And what I found, and I tried this out actually, and it's like, wow, that worked. But it requires a lot of humility. That if someone comes to you with a perspective, oh, and then people talk this, you're ruining our school. You're making it
Mhm.
so these kids who belong to these standardized classes are now in our honors classes. Like, how are you doing? What kind of standards do you have? You're ruining our school, right?
Mhm.
And so I would then get defensive and then go on to explain the theory behind it. Like you know, I would try to just explain more from a place
Yeah.
of defense. And like, you just must not be understanding, right? Because we're
Okay.
not going to have these systems of oppression anymore. I'd be clapping on it. We're not going to have these systems of oppression anymore, no matter what you think, right? And
Okay.
so either get on board or, there might be other places. Oh, okay, he going off. He's hearing
I'm
everything.
so sorry.
No, we're good. That's fine. It adds texture to it. Like we real people. And so the question that I should have been asking, oh, the statement I should have made to lead us into a non-defensive conversation is, I accept your perspective, right? I accept it. I understand it. And that comes from a place like, I still have the goal of undoing systems of oppression, but I need you on my team. So
Yes.
your perspective of me actually doesn't matter. What
Yes.
matters is my ability to get you on board with where we're going. And once we give them the opportunity to unload, like, all right, so I accept it, I understand it. Now where do we go? And I tried this out a few times. I'm like, that's amazing. So I wish I could go back in time and be like, put up a sign in my office that says, remember to always accept a perspective. That would have saved so much heartache,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Around trying to prove to folks that what I was doing was right, right? And they need to
Yes.
get on board. No, I accept your perspective. Because once they start talking, they actually give you information how to better get them on board,
Yes.
right? Rather than a
Absolutely.
confrontation.
I love that. I mean, I think for me, that thing is just like being socially aware. So, like for you, you said you would ask them their perspective. I would just become more socially aware of the fact that I am not connecting some of my thoughts to student outcomes. I don't want to have to explain this all the time. Like I just want to do, and I want you to trust me to do, but sometimes people need more information. People need to better understand. And so, like, for me, I'm like, no, we're doing it this way because this makes sense. Like, let's go. We're doing it this way. But my social emotional intelligence and my ego sometimes would not allow me the space to be like, all right, let me slow down and let me keep my eye on the prize. I was more, again, committed to the job, getting the job done versus committed to the work of moving students. So like I can go into really hostile situations. Like my gift is I can go into really hostile situations and create calm. But once I create calm, how do I then can still remain focused on student outcomes? And sometimes I would get lost in that. And I blame that on my social emotional intelligence and that social awareness piece. And like being able to bring people along for the ride. Like, I'm not doing this by myself. I can't teach everyone kind of thing. But when I said it, I could understand why a teacher might feel like in a defensive mode because I'm saying, I need you to do this. I can't do it by myself. Versus, this is why we're doing it this way. Do you have something to add? How do you feel about it? I didn't have the muscle, I'll say,
Mhm.
to do that. I have been placed in environments that seem to be on fire, and they would bring me in to bring the calm. But that
Mhm.
calm typically never is connected to academics and student outcomes, which is
Mhm.
why with that one client that we have, I can talk through this idea of compliance versus
Mhm.
student outcome, positive student outcomes, because I can get that compliance piece down. But now let's talk about how to take these kids to the next level so that we can see long-term impacts of what we did with them when they were in our learning institutions. And I think that's what we sign up for.
Wonderful. Wonderful. All right. We got 2 minutes left. I don't want to keep you all day. This has been great. I think, this might be one of our best watched episodes. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Anti Racism Leadership Institute podcast. Remember, the fight against racism starts with each and every one of us. Together, we can create inclusive environments in our schools that celebrate diversity and empower all students. For more information, visit our website at antiracisminstitute.com and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time as we continue to shine a light on the champions of change. Stay inspired, committed, and let's make a difference together.